Okay, great. So thank you so much
Y-
and welcome
yes.
to the last session for today, which is the second roundtable discussion. Do you have a special title for the roundtable?
We're following what is on the program, Redefining Gender in 500 Years of Christianity.
Okay, okay, great. So I think we're only waiting for Dr. Mary, but while we're waiting, we can go ahead and introduce our panel members. So first we have our first speaker will be Maria Estela Banasihan. She is from the Ateneo de Manila University and her paper will be on Babayalnismo, the sacred and the profane in historical space. Our second speaker will be Rachel Joyce Mary O. Sanchez from the Ateneo de Manila University. She will be presenting Giving the Virgin Mary and Mary Magdalene a Makeover. Our third speaker will be Mary Racelis, also from the Ateneo de Manila University, presenting From Urbana at Felisa to Jane, See Jane Run, American Colonial Reshaping of the Filipina Image. And our final speaker will be Jayeel Cornelio, also from Ateneo de Manila University, presenting The Rise of Militant Christianity is the New Narrative.
So, hello everybody, and welcome to session 9, Redefining Gender in 500 Years of Christianity. So, as mentioned earlier, we have a good lineup of speakers, and I've heard them all before. And what is nice about this roundtable is that we're looking at religion through the lens of gender, but in different times along a very long timeline, 500 years of Christianity. So mentioned earlier was Babaylan, which I think mostly is pre-Hispanic. Then we have Virgin Mary, and this would be situated during the Spanish period, and Urbana at Felisa during the American period. And rounding that off is Militant Christianity, 500 Militant Christianity by Dr. Cornelio. So this is actually part of a larger project called 500 Years of Christianity in the Philippines, a multidisciplinary research program on narratives and counter-narratives. So the convener here is the Institute of Philippine Culture of the School of Social Sciences. And the project aims to develop a 2-year multidisciplinary research program, bringing together a multidisciplinary group of researchers from anthropology, history, philosophy, political science, sociology, and theology who have come together to explore counter narratives under the theme of 500 years of Christianity. And we hope that it will bring significant insights into understandings of Filipino life, domains over 5 centuries. So, also mentioned earlier was the order in which our speakers will present. So we have Maria Estela Banasihan. So I'll read all of their short bios first before turning over the mic to the first speaker. Maria Estela Banasihan is a faculty member of history, the History Department of Ateneo de Manila. She's currently doing her dissertation for her PhD in Philippine Studies at UP Diliman and received her MA in Education at the Ateneo de Manila University with a Bachelor of Arts in Philosophy from the University of the Philippines. Aside from teaching, she's also involved with handling seminar workshops on teaching global and Asian histories and philosophies, Korean studies, and teacher training. Her research interests includes identities in nationhood, Asian philosophies, cultural and gender studies, globalization, migration and diaspora, social and critical history, and multicultural education. And her current research is on women in Philippine history, identities, and diaspora. Ray Sanchez, our second speaker, teaches college and graduate theology at the Loyola Schools, Ateneo de Manila University. She finished her doctoral studies in the Loyola School of Theology with a dissertation on post-colonial Filipino feminist theologies. Her research interests include contextual theologies, liberation theologies, post-colonial thought, gender and feminist perspectives. She is the Faculty Social Involvement Coordinator of the School of Humanities and moderator of the student organization ASIL, or the Ateneo Catechetical Instruction League. Mary Racelis joined the Ateneo de Manila faculty in June 1960 and was the first woman professor in the college. I can stop there. She and Father Franklin, then started both started the Institute of Philippine Culture and the Department of Sociology and Anthropology. Invited her to be among the first staff members. She's currently research scientist at the Institute of Philippine Culture, which she co-founded, and is senior lecturer at the DSA and at the UP Department of Sociology. And finally, we have Dr. Jayeel S. Cornelio, Associate Professor and Director of Development Studies in Ateneo. He finished his PhD in sociology in 2011 at the National University of Singapore and is a recipient of a doctoral grant from ARI, the Asian Research Institute. He has since held visiting posts at Lancaster University, Lucian Blaga University, Chinese University of Hong Kong, and was a postdoctoral fellow at the Max Planck Institute for Study of Religious and Ethnic Diversity. He's also an associate editor of the journal Social Sciences and Missions, and the broad theme of his work is religion and social change in the Philippines. His scholarly writings have appeared in a number of edited volumes and leading journals, and he's currently the author of Being Catholic. Oh, this is his book, Being Catholic in Contemporary Philippines, Young People Reinterpreting Religion, published in 2016. He is also the editor of Rethinking Filipino Millennials, Alternative Perspectives on a Misunderstood Generation 2020, apart from regularly contributing to Rappler. So I think we have made the introductions, and definitely just by the introductions, we will have a very interesting um, panel.
So, hello everyone. Good afternoon. I'm going to share some thoughts about giving the Virgin Mary and Mary Magdalene makeover. Okay. Maria is a very common name for Filipinos. In Catholic Christianity, two women with the name Mary stand out. First is the Virgin Mary, who is seen positively as pure and honored. Second is Mary Magdalene, who is often seen negatively as a prostituted woman and sinner. Despite different portrayals, both images are produced by patriarchy and have been instrumental in Spanish colonization. So much so that Latin American feminist Marcela Altus Reed surmised that while she saw the vulva in the Virgin of Guadalupe, lifting her skirt would reveal a hegemonic phallus. We shall see how both images have emerged out of patriarchal theologizing and how they have been deployed in Spain's colonization of the Philippines. We will end with some examples of how Filipina feminist theologians have sought to recover these images that have been long used to subjugate women. Okay. The Virgin Mary was portrayed as either the feminine maternal face of God to balance an increasingly stern and authoritarian image of God the Father, or as the ideal woman who embodies the femininity patriarchy expects women to live up to, while actually marginalizing the different ways of being woman in various cultures, social locations, and personal circumstances. In effect, Mary becomes alienated from real women, and her image has become oppressive. In Mulieris Dignitatem, John Paul II's apostolic letter on the dignity of women, the Pope sums up the vocation of women in terms of motherhood and virginity, best manifested by the Virgin Mary. Who else can become both virgin and mother at the same time? Not only could we not expect every woman to be both, it is also problematic to expect all women to be either. To be fair, the meaning of virginity and motherhood has been expanded in the document to include evangelical virginity and spiritual motherhood. Nevertheless, preoccupation with virginity has become a tool for controlling women's bodies. For instance, a study on Filipinos' valuation of virginity, conducted by Eric Manalastas and Clarissa David, reveals a double standard with regards to virginity. Virginity loss is expected of men, but women's virginity continues to be widely valued. The image of the Virgin Mary, blessed among women, who was pure and immaculate, became very unrelatable to women who found it impossible to fit into the ideal she projected. Hence, another image of a woman was needed, that of Mary Magdalene. This woman became the face of women who were impure and sinful, who threw themselves at the feet of Jesus for mercy and forgiveness. The Mary Magdalene that became popular during the medieval period was said to have come from Pope Gregory I, who combined different women in the Gospels, such as the exorcised woman, the woman who washed Jesus' feet with her hair, the woman caught in adultery, and the woman with five husbands, into one Mary Magdalene, who became erotically portrayed as a prostitute. Mary John Manansan identified religion as an influential ideological apparatus that has conditioned society's expectations of women and how women also understand themselves. The Spanish and Catholic colonization affected how women's bodies are regarded in Philippine culture. Caroline Brewer explains that the Spanish male priests employed preaching, songs, and dramatic performances to substitute the ancestral beliefs and practices to signify women as falling within the virgin whore dichotomy being communicated by Catholicism. On one hand, the Virgin Mary was introduced to be part of people's belief system as a good woman whose virginity was thereby emphasized. With the elevation of virginity as a virtue, women who failed to fit the criteria of virgin were perceived to be of lower moral status. On the other hand, Mary Magdalene was among the few female saints who was introduced among Filipinos while not being a virgin. Being non-virginal was to be unholy, and so these women absolved themselves by being Christian mothers. Mary Magdalene, who was understood to be neither a virgin nor a mother, seemed out of place. She was the sinful seductress or prostitute woman women should avoid becoming unless they are ready to take on an attitude of perpetual repentance. The image of Mary Magdalene associated with a prostituted woman is retained and popularly expressed by Freddie Aguilar in his song Magdalena and is also picked up by Glock 9 in the song Magda. Some Filipinas who are both Catholic yet critical of the Catholic faith engage in feminist theological recoveries to, in a sense, give the Virgin Mary and Mary Magdalene the much needed makeover. Historian Mina Roses identifies two phases in the history of feminism in the Philippines. The first one consisted of suffragettes around the 1920s and 1930s who sought to reform the Spanish Civil Code. The second phase takes place after the 1980s until the present. Contemporary efforts in feminist theology can be located within the second phase, which is informed by experiences of activism against martial law and involved different activities like rethinking the Filipino woman, recovering women's subjectivities and bodies, highlighting women's experiences, and challenging patriarchal norms and values. These theologians admit that the Bible carries patriarchal biases. If women are mentioned, they must be important. Therefore, these contested images must be reclaimed. To unburden to unburden Mary of the role of representing divine femininity so that she can be appreciated as a human being again, the masculine image of God needs to be deconstructed. God transcends sex and is neither male nor female. We speak of God in terms of metaphors. However, language also shapes our consciousness. Because of the prevalent use of male and masculine images of God, we have learned to imagine God as male. Feminist theologians point out that qualities society attributes to femininity, such as compassion, creativity, nurturing motherhood, and gentleness, can legitimately be associated with God. The necessity of Mary's virginity also needs to be dismantled. Christians believe that Jesus is the incarnated Son of God, the second person of the Trinity. This truth is not premised on whether or not his mother is or was a virgin. According to Benedict XVI, then Cardinal Ratzinger, according to the faith of the Church, the sonship of Jesus does not rest on the fact that Jesus had no human father. The doctrine of Jesus' divinity would not be affected if Jesus had been a product of normal human marriage. For the sonship of which faith speaks is not a biological but an ontological fact, an event not in time but in God's eternity. Mary John Manansan explains that the image of the Virgin Mary brought by missionaries as a model for women is one that is patterned after Iberian ideals and has been used to inculcate the value of virginity. Sister Jani, a religious sister who is also an Ifugao, recalls the Virgin Mary as one of the predominant images used in their Christianization, a process which resulted to the following for her. I was slowly becoming alienated from my own tribal traditions and collective way of dealing with problems. I followed what nice Christian girls were supposed to do, and that meant not going mountain climbing with the boys or swimming against the river current. To present more liberating images of Mary for Philippine women, Hilda Buhay goes back to scripture. She interprets Mary's yes not as blind obedience, but as an active willingness to participate in salvation. In the wedding at Cana, she takes the initiative to respond to a problem out of concern for others. Her Magnificat is a revolutionary song that expresses the struggles and yearnings of her people. Agnes Brazal uses feminist post-colonial hermeneutics to recover women's leadership roles in the early church and uncover how patriarchal and androcentric biases covered up women's leadership. For instance, while Mary Magdalene is the first witness to the resurrection according to the Gospel of John, neither she nor the other women are mentioned by Paul. Also, a woman that could have also been included among the circle of apostles in Jerusalem was named Junia, but later translators translated her name as Unian because it was very difficult to imagine a female apostle. Judith Galiares therefore calls Mary Magdalene a disenfranchised apostle, and we read scripture in relation to women today who are also being silenced or set aside. She presents Mary Magdalene as a woman who was very close to Jesus and whose life Jesus has profoundly touched. She stood courageously with Jesus at the foot of the cross, even when the men ran away. She was the first witness to the resurrection and was commissioned by Jesus to proclaim what she saw. Unfortunately, the disciples did not believe her and even thought that she might be crazy. This goes to show that women's struggle for credibility dates from way back and that the Philippine church and wider society risk missing out on hearing the good news when women are not heard. So, in conclusion, both Marys can be powerful yet relatable images if reclaimed and reimagined by Philippine women. Filipina Catholics inherited a faith tradition that has not been very empowering to women and has played a role both in colonizing people and controlling women's sexuality. But paradoxically, motivated by the same faith, Filipina feminist theologians seek to reconstruct and transform what has been handed to them. Yun. So thank you. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Ray. Now we move on to Maria Estela Banasihan, Babayalnismo, the sacred and profane in historical space.
Good afternoon, everyone. So, my topic is about Babaylanismo, the sacred and the profane. So, just to give you an idea, this is part and parcel of my work as part of my research. So, the most important thing about this is this is connected with other gender studies and also the presentation on gender this afternoon. So I title it Babaylanismo because it talks about Babaylan, the religious leaders or spiritual leaders to be exact during the prehistoric Philippines, and why the sacred and the profane in historical space, because I'd like to emphasize that during that moment in time in history, the definition of sacred and profane can be used in a way by both sides, through the lens of the Spaniards or Spanish colonizers and through the eyes of the Babaylans. So to start with that, let me just share with you this picture. So it's the painting by Fernando Morsola. It's entitled The Burning of the Idols. So if you're going to look at the picture, well, I will not delve into art studies aspect, but just I entice you to look at it. So you can see at the foreground the burning of the idols of seemingly native people, and at the back you will see the cross with people huddled underneath. So the questions can be actually triggered. No? So in that sense, that is this a picture of people's acquiescence to the powers that be? Were they really dutifully burning the icons according to their own accord in that sense? But as you can see, this is just an impression of the past. But we can look at other people who actually, in a way, fought back against the foreign colonizers. And one of those would be the group of the Babaylans. So, what would be or what is a Babaylan? So, I just got the common usage of it for common understanding. But of course, there are anthropological, sociological definitions, but just to get the usual understanding of a Babaylan, because in historical writings, mostly you will see a Babaylan is a shaman. And what is a shaman? A tribal leader who can act as a medium between the visible world and the spirit world. Shamans are kind of a mix between priests and doctors. Like a priest, a shaman is a holy man who represents a religion. Furthermore, he or she is believed to interact with the spirit world through altered states of consciousness, specifically to do healing. So with this common picture of Babaylan, in a way, I'll present to you how this particular leadership, because Babaylans were considered as leaders during that time in animistic pre-Hispanic Philippines. So I got some examples about animism as practiced in Visayas, wherein animism was, in a way, an envelope, no, of their lives, their daily lives. So some excerpts are gotten from William Scott. Visayans considered themselves vastly outnumbered by a variety of invisible beings of spirits and deities. These were generally benevolent and neutral and could be approached ritually for good crops, health, fortune, but they also caused illnesses or misfortune if not given due respect. They also believed that supernatural forces filled the natural world with signs and portents that it would be unwise to ignore. So the Babaylans, in a way, would be those assigned to observe the behavior of birds and reptiles, or could be elicited by this could be elicited by omen seeking and other ceremonies. In other words, animism as a form of belief actually, in a way, accepts the idea that the whole cosmos, now I'm talking about indigenous cosmology now, is actually run by a supernatural force. And there's no dichotomy between the spiritual world and the temporal world. So this kind of idea, this kind of life, this kind of mindset is quite different from the mindset of the coming colonizers. So for the Babaylan is seen by pre-Hispanic communities as such. They were called femine vequi or veki, meaning old women. So as always, some people would actually, or some shows on particular TV shows or movies, they would present a Babaylan or a shaman as a young woman, a pretty woman, but actually they were not. No? They were old women. And according to Salazar's research, they were actually around 50 years old and above, meaning menopausal women already. But here's the thing about it: menopausal, they cannot give birth, but at this point at the point in their lives, but they are tasked to give birth to something else, like ideas, wisdom, safety, and caring. So in that sense, in the eyes of early barangay communities, a babaylan is a medicine woman. So for physical ailments, all right. So any type of ailment. So a babaylan is also an herbalist in that sense. No, a babaylan is a ritual leader. So she is there from birth to death. Okay, so from the child being born, getting married, or reaching or doing the rites of passage upon entering adulthood or puberty or old age, and until death. So she is seen to be a very important element of the community. She's also a counselor. Someone or anyone can actually approach her and ask for her advice about life, about decision making, about love life, and what have you. She was a political advisor. She used to sit with the datus, especially about issues relating to relationships with or relations with other barangays in that sense. In a way, she was also an arbiter. An arbiter would sit together in a group, listen to the grievances, and in the end, she would actually decide on the grievances. Most of all, she was a teacher. She was in a way, the vehicle, the receptacle of ideas, cultural ideas. She was a cultural, in a way, icon in that sense, because she would be handling all these things, no? And she would teach the younger set, the younger generations about these things. She was a historian because she would actually, in a way, document by memorizing, telling stories, and transferring the stories to the next generation, to the community, night and day, to tell the story of the past. And later on, upon the latter portion of her life, she would be tasked to transfer the knowledge orally to the next one, the next chosen babaylan. Thus, she was seen as a bridge, a channel between man and the spirit world. In a way, you would see her as a very powerful being in that sense. But upon the arrival of the Spaniards in the Philippine shores, they would be so surprised about what they would be seeing in our own communities. Because first and foremost, the Babaylan was part of the leadership. The Datu was actually the political and economic leader, and the Panday would be chosen to the technology, in terms of war and also in terms of peace in making farming implements. But the Babaylan would be so powerful that, again, as mentioned, she was a counselor, advisor to the Datu. And most of all, she was actually a leader in worship. So the Spaniards, actually, the colonists, particularly the accounts, not taken from the accounts of the missionaries, would actually call her a bruja. Well, you would mistake this as a term for a Latin American term of bruja, a witch, or a medicine woman for that matter. But the bruja here is tied to an old hag. Okay, so matanda. So having this sorcery, the knowledge of sorcery, and using it against her enemies. Hechicera, meaning an enchantress. So how do you differentiate that from the bruja? The hechicera is actually an enchantress, meaning she will be very good looking, very handsome, very pretty, and yet she could actually do some, in a way, magic against the enemy. Someone who works with the devil, so she was called Diablesa or Yawa, for the Visayan among us, Yawa, the devil, or Yawa Yawa later on. She was known as the priestess of hell, sacerdotisa del infierno, or priestess of demons, sacerdotisa del demonio, or cursed priestess, alitera maldita, or worse, the shape-shifting evil spirit, or oswang, or for us now, aswang. So all negative, pejorative, in a way, naming in that sense. So there was a sort of renaming. And in renaming, it was a step towards eradicating all the power, in a way, and attributes of the previous name given to the Babaylan. So after that, of course, many things happen, especially the persecution of all the Babaylans. There will be some accounts wherein they will be tortured, burned to death, thrown to the rivers to be eaten by the crocodiles. But I think I got this particular excerpt, which I think was so sad in contemplating what happened to the Babaylan. So the ritual instruments were actually confiscated from the Babaylans. And the decision to have those instruments confiscated in Bababukay, which is in Bataan, violated, profaned, and contaminated by body waste. So one way of humiliating and dehumanizing the Babaylan would be to use the contamination of these instruments by body waste. In the privy carries an added dimension of not just destroying the items, but by doing repeatedly the dishonoring and defiling of religion of ancestors. And by implication, the Catalonans or the Tagalog counterpart of Babaylan, by whose spiritual prowess the gods were placated, the sick healed, the crops encouraged to flourish, the dead revered, and the environment made safe. All these implements, all these symbols of that power were actually eradicated. So the desecration by body waste of the instruments which were used for storing aromatic oils for anointing the hair of the shamans or the Babaylan and offering foods to their nitos was a powerful symbolic act of utmost sacrilege and profanity. But here's the thing. Those who were tasked to do that were not the priests, all right? But the laity, those who were converted, those who were actually, in a way, uh, catechized in the Catholic faith. By hearing those and by showing the damnation caused by this, in a way, profane activities of the Babaylan, these newly converted actually were the soldiers who were tasked to destroy these instruments used by the Babaylan. So it was so disheartening for Babaylan to watch as those materials were being destroyed by her own fellow men. So the changing of narrative happened along the way. So the Babaylans at this point were now considered as the usual, medicine women, but not necessarily powerful as the bridge between God and man. So they still continue doing their jobs or their work as midwives, but they can only do so with someone as a chaperone. And most of the time, here comes, or at this point, there came to be the male Babaylan. Only those male Babaylan were allowed by the missionaries to go on as priests, well, considering they were males, and at the same time, quite similar to the role of the Catholic priests. So, in performing, the midwives, together with the male Babaylan looking on, in performing their functions, pray to the first wives of the world, whom they do not know, saying, O first wife, by your goodwill, now grant me the favor, such that through my help this creature may be born. So before assisting the pregnant woman to give birth. But you can see the line, whom they do not know, in a way attributing, in a way, sort of an ignorance for the Babaylan. To continue an excerpt from Manila manuscript, in the ancient days of superstition, when a man fell sick, he generally died because he was treated only by the witchcraft or the aniteras, no, as the name now assigned by the Spaniards to the Babaylan, whose sole purpose was to get gold from the sick persons by false promises. If you're going to like this, it's like, it was written, the ideology behind it, written in the eyes of someone who's really part and parcel of this grand narrative of Christianizing the natives in that sense. So if you go, or the indigenes for that in that sense. So if you're going to look at this, it's like fake stories or fake news, but it was proliferated during that moment in time. So the factors to reconsider as we look at this, uh, the question of ideology, meaning the Reconquista or Conquista worldview versus indigenous cosmology, and understanding the history of the Babaylan. In that sense, that many written materials were not written by the Babaylans themselves. Mostly were done by missionaries, done by Spaniards, and of course, the reason behind those chronicles, the reason behind those records. So you just have to read between the lines to really understand what really happened and how the Reconquista worldview, which is really as part and parcel of what happened in Europe, which started in 722 AD up to 1492, as a way of recovering the lands from the Moors or the Muslims, from the time. It was also part and parcel of their act here in the Philippine shores during that moment in time. So they saw everything as as a battle within sacred and profane, and the Babaylan's activities were considered as profane in that sense. So, in a way, the indigenous cosmology would also look at what happened in the same way. So they looked at what the priests, the missionaries, and the Spaniard colonizers did as profane, a direct, in a way, affront against their belief in the sacred. So there, in a way, it's important to look at the situation in different lenses as we understand what happened in the Babaylan. As mentioned, the worst part of it is it's so difficult to look for the writings done by the Babaylan because most of the ideas were actually by word of mouth, so by oral tradition, and also at the same time because of destruction done. So it was so difficult to look for basis only by reading twice the records that you will see what happened. And the second part to be considered is the twice silencing, or more I placed here, silencing of the Babaylan. Not only because they were Babaylans or in that sense, but also because a Babaylan is a woman, which is a powerful woman having a very high status of society, which would be against the very ideology during the moment of time, the ideology of the colonizers. She was an indigene, a native, a non-Christian, a primitive person from the past. So the manner of gendering of woman as placing the woman in her proper place happened early in the Philippine shores. It is a case of gendering and a sense of othering. So in a way, it is important to take note that we have to have a new framework for studying this aspect of Philippine history, not only to understand the women in history, which is my interest in doing this study, but also to fit it in Philippine history Some historians say there was no history before the coming of the Spaniards. Well, let's take that as okay. Yeah, we can accommodate that. But actually, in order to understand Philippine history, we have to look back at the very roots. And I would like to believe that time of the Baybayin will be part and parcel of the roots of our culture. So, and I always have to consider the deliberate inclusion in the study of Philippine history. When I say deliberate, meaning not only in terms of talking about it, researching about it, but actually sharing about it, especially in the textbooks being used in our schools. You don't get to see those aspects in the Philippine textbooks. Normally, okay, the Christianization of the Philippines and the good things that we were Christianized and thank you very well and thank you. But what is the most important thing is to be critical about it. What happened during that time? And I think I can relate this to our topic about the celebration of 500 years of Christianity in the Philippines. It was not all glory. Let's be honest. We have to consider the manner of saying sorry, as questioned last time, yesterday's roundtable, is also to be deliberate in writing about it, in teaching about it. In so doing, we are not only saying sorry to some people, but also saying sorry to history. So I'd like to end by sharing, by quoting Spivak, Beatrice Spivak, in terms of challenging perspectives, to dispense with notions of objectivity and instead implement a double vision, a simultaneous focus on both the researcher and the research, and a dual problem of one representing the other. It's high time to look at our lenses, not only to discuss, to observe, or to interpret what we see, but try to enter to what we are seeing, to get the context, our context, as the one doing the research, and the context of the research, the voice coming from the research. So, in that sense, it is important to take note of that, not only as a historian, but also as a Filipino. To end, I'd like to share with you a warning coming, which was in a way dictated. I got this from Karen Brewer from her book. Cariapa, who was a babaylan in Bohol, sang a hymn. Well, they used to sing a hymn whenever they say their prophecy or their forecast. In 1609, talking to the chieftains of Bohol. This was 2 years before the coming of the Spaniards in Bohol. She said something like this: "This land will be changed. Other people will possess it with another culture, other practices. This town is to be utterly destroyed. This province with the rest of the islands will be subjugated." A clear-cut warning, not only for the chieftains, datus of the town, but for all of us. Only by trying to see the currents of the day and by understanding the past that we will be able to make changes for the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Estela. Very
Thank you.
indeed. Now we move on to Dr. Mary Racelis from Urbana at Felisa to Jane. C. Jane Run. C. Jane Run, American Colonial Reshaping of the Filipina Image. Mary? Mary, I think your mic is on mute.
Unmute. All right. Yes. Now can you hear me? Start video. Okay. All right. Now. Hello. Can I speak? Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you.
All right. Wonderful. Yeah. I guess Julian, if you can put the first slide on, just so we know what we're looking at today. If you're trying to see where are we in terms of women and men today, you really have to go back to who were we before Spain and the Americas and the Americans came. And the way I've tried to conceptualize that is really, although I start with Urbana at Felisa as one example, you have to start with the framework of what was it like before Spain came. And what was the context of the society? These were small clusters of people, fisher folk, if they were on a river or coast, or if somewhere inland, not so much. They were kind of hunter-gatherers, kaingin, Sweden agriculturists in some area of the land. You had small settlements like Manila, the Muslim South, which had maybe more complex kinds of society, but the basics were hunting, gathering, kaingin people living in clusters of their own. And in that context, and that is still true today, if you go to an Aita or Agta community, where they're still doing hunting, gathering, you will be maybe surprised, I don't know, but at the equality that you see present in those societies. They do different things, of course, but often their roles connect as they struggle to make a life for themselves in a kaingin hunting-gathering environment. So that is the context in which Filipino women basically were equal. They inherited equally. It was a bilateral system of descent, which means the children are equally related to both sides. And so women had a place in society which was very clear. And the Babaylan story, particularly, I think, highlights some aspects of that. So then comes Spain, in effect by 1565. I won't go into all of that history, but I decided to start around the late 19th century, because that is when the so-called proto-novels began to emerge, like Urbana at Felisa, written in Tagalog by somebody at Tagalog, and a couple of other items, Tandang Basyo, Makunat, and so you have this literature beginning to come out. It's literature. These are not on-site accounts, although we have some of those too, that really kind of portray how is the Filipina seen, right? There are not so many evidences, but here's a case of Urbana at Felisa, written by Modesto de Castro, Presbiterio, who, in behalf of two sisters, one named Urbana, who is studying at a convent school in Manila, and Felisa, her sister, who is in Paombong, Bulacan, at home, and they write letters to each other. Now, that's an imagined correspondence because those letters are written by Presbiterio Modesto de Castro. But those got circulated as, the proper way to be, right? Essentially, that book shows how the ideal Filipina woman should be. It's very clear that he is talking about middle upper class women, you might say elite women, middle upper class women who have gotten some education and are in the more powerful families of society. How should they act? Well, I think from the previous discussions, you can already see, the ideal woman is framed as she's either a daughter, a good wife, or a good mother. The metaphors of her, she's like a flower or a fragile glass, and the what do you call it? A qualification for her is her virginity, as Mary, as we found in the previous discussion. The evil one, the ones he says you have to stay away from because are bad because they're like Eve or Delilah, sinful temptresses, causing the fall of their male partners. So the connection, the gender connection is important. The women have to uphold the dignity and the morality of the husband, where morality is not his strongest suit, but it's supposed to be her strongest suit, and she's responsible for it in the family. So she's persevering, submissive to the male side, but she has to be there to back him up. Right now, De Castro recognizes there are differences between urban, rural, between those who are Hispanized and not Hispanized, and of course the non-Hispanic are the indigenous people still at the time, are primitive and so on, superstitious, as we've already heard. So that was the image, and you see that anytime there are written references to what women are supposed to be like. But observations of other travelers and other writers on the ground uh, have shown that Filipinas women were operating in many fields, that they were really working. We know that cigar factories run by the Spaniards were staffed by women by and large, and they were said to be chosen because they were honest and hardworking, right? But the Dr. Kamagai, who has written extensively about this, points out that the literature also shows that if they felt imposed upon, they would get a complaint to their bosses that this is not the way this should be. So the sense of agency is apparently there, even though in general they're supposed to be submissive and hardworking. They were vendors in the streets, in the market. They were domestic servants. They were maestras, even in the Spanish system. Costureras, embroiderers, often exploited by the upper class, the ones who were doing the sinamay trade and making beautiful clothing, sometimes at the expense, often at the poor women who earned very little, but who were expert in art, bordadera, designing. Interestingly, they were not classified as artists, even though if they created a dress or a pattern, you would have to say they were artists, but that was not considered proper art. Art is painting and sculpture, and women were not allowed, in a sense, to get into that. So you have sex workers, but interestingly, it seems that they would be penalized, but if they married, if the man who was with them would marry them, that was okay. There seemed to be no negative views on it, according to Kamagai. So that's kind of interesting there too. They were slightly in political participation. We know that they were maneuvering in the preparations for the Philippine Revolution and during it, but kind of always in the background, except here and there you have famous women. And the Babaylans, it's already been discussed. So the view of women at the end of the Spanish period was that they are basically intellectually superior to men. You see that all the time in the literature. But they seem to be subservient, but they in reality dominate him because they know how to manipulate him to what they want to do. That's one image, right? They're honest, hardworking, they have business skills, they're devoted wives. As one said, well, they may be brown, but they have a special beauty. And if you just look at them, you realize there is beauty in that, even if she's brown, right? And so on. So the bridegroom has to contribute resources to the bride's household to show her value, and so on. She's faithful, but she will also be very jealous if her husband is foundering. So that's what comes into the image of the Filipina woman. The lower class, or you say the farming, the working women, we know from some discussions, as Kamagai has pointed out, were involved in many things, outside the home, inside the home, and that was totally in keeping what was considered a proper role for them, as long as they recognized the importance of the male and that they catered to the male desires or needs, wants. So what happens? The Americans come in 1900, and this is one of their first attempts at colonization. As you know from history, it was very debatable in the United States. There were many who fought colonization, both in Cuba, Philippines, because of their own history. How can we colonize when we ourselves fought colonialism? But nonetheless, the power of the time decided that they should enable this poor, benighted group of people who have been under Spain for so long to come into the proper world, and we will teach them what democracy is. And as we know, we will Christianize them. Of course, they didn't seem to realize that 85 or something like, a huge proportion were already Christian Catholics and had been for more than 300 years. So the Philippines is going to be the beacon of democracy in Asia. And the Americans are going to start by bringing in teachers. The Thomasites, as they call them, come from the ship, which was called the Transport Thomas, which arrived with 509 teachers. These are all trained teachers who qualified through exams, 368 men, 141 women. And they were recruited often because they knew some Spanish. It was very clear they had to be able to know Spanish in order to make the transition to teaching in English and train Filipino children to speak in English and therefore get the benefits of democracy and all that it has to offer. Initially, children in communities had to be dragged to school. They were petrified, especially if it was a male, because they're tall and white, and kids were afraid. When they were women, they were not so afraid. They would go, which was an advantage that the women teachers had. But the males also had the connection with having been soldiers with guns and part of the Filipino-American War, which was going on for many years after 1900, at the same time that the teachers were coming in. So all these teachers come in and they're going to teach the 3 R's, reading, writing, arithmetic, but also democracy and values, right? Important values, which were, of course, American middle class values. The Filipinos, by and large, and the priests very much against it because they saw it as a cover for bringing in Protestant conversions, right? So that's why there was a lot of resistance, plus the fact that you now have a public school system in which boys and girls can come. It was co-ed, right? At the beginning, of course, maybe fewer girls, but over time, more and more girls began to come. And the value emphasis on individualism, that your individual abilities are and your performance, how you are as one person, is what really makes an important society. So the whole connection, the Philippine context of family, kin groups, and so on, is not dismissed. But what is added is in all that, you have to start yourself. You assess yourself, right? And that referred to whether you're a boy or a girl. And the girls soon found out that because they were more used to paying attention to detail, follow through from their traditional duties in the home, they began to excel in school and in many ways do much better than the boys in exams, for example, in public speaking to some extent. And there were many performances, debate clubs, and so on, that girls who were particularly talented in that way could shine. And that was a tremendous change of that self-awareness that the schools brought, right? And their parents were really quite thrilled when they would come to school for the programs and see their children performing like that individually. So this notion that this is a school of the devil, which is what the local priests would call it, began to wane after some time, right? And the fact that the schools were at the beginning, they were not well equipped, but over time, they got books and pencils and so on. And so the enrollment grew, and from 1904, when already there were 50,000 waiting to go to school, by 1911, you had 355,000 school kids enrolled, grade school. By 1920, you had 1 million, right? So it kept growing, but even, as of 1931, there were already 1,200,000 kids in grade school, but that still only represented 37% of the population. So they still had a problem. All right, so going back to the values, individual achievements, and girls, therefore, could excel, and it's not wrong. They don't have to be subservient because the teacher would praise them, right? The dignity of labor, that was very important, very difficult to communicate, especially to the boys when they had to work in the school garden. They would bring what they would call their muchachos, and the teacher would say, no, you can't do it. You have to do it. It's your job. The girls were learning embroidery, of course. Otherwise, they had the same curriculum. No corporal punishment. They went into school governance. Normally the boys would get the leadership positions, but over time, the girls became the secretary of the school council. And then little by little, some began to be vice president and even president. So it was a long process, right? Now, sportsmanship, that's another thing. They introduced baseball, volleyball, baseball, basketball, for boys and girls. They had separate teams, but girls also had sportsmanship where you learn the qualities of good sportsmanship, being on time, being honest when you play, and so on. So in school, you think, you don't memorize, you think, all right? That. And in other words, building up self-confidence of girls was tremendous. Of course, the gap between school and home and the community was very great, but that had to be negotiated very often by the children themselves. The teachers were role models, especially the women teachers, but the male too. But the women, they liked a lot because they were usually compassionate, caring. They didn't carry the stigma of having been a soldier in the war. Many times when a woman was leaving, the whole town would send a petition to Department of Education to say, no, don't let her go. Give her another extension, because they were very popular. Many of them were really very popular. The fact that they lived in the town or small city, usually if it's a woman, they had another woman teacher with them, meant the only friends they would have would be the Filipinos in the community. So they were often invited out. They got to know the people. There was no group of Americans that they would stick to because there were only two of them. Sometimes a soldier would come through, but that was it. So the fact that they had to integrate in some way into the community meant that their influence was really very strong as role models for girls. We cannot forget that, by I think by 1914 or something like that, there were really no more ever than 500 American white, and they were white, that's another thing, white American teachers in the system. The ones who were carrying the school system by that time were Filipino teachers. And they were very well trained. I mean, of course, in the American thing, they all knew the Gettysburg Address, and about Thanksgiving is for turkeys and what happened there. So they knew American history. I have to say, when I was in second grade, my sister was in fourth grade. She was studying geography, and she knew all the states of the U.S., which I think were 48. And as her younger sister, I had to learn all the capitals of every state in the United States, because she said that's the proper way to know about important things. So just to give you an example, let me say, all right, so the school system was really crucial in bringing about new sets of values in very practical ways with children who are very flexible, as you can say. This has been in Philippine literature discussed as miseducation of the Filipino, and there's a whole lot of literature on that. But Judy Ick is a professor at UP who has written a lot also on the Thomasites. What she mainly concluded, because she's an activist, nationalist herself, what she concluded was, when you look at what actually happened on the ground versus what the national perspective that's promoted now in many textbooks, as you see how distorted it is. Actually, it's what was just said in the previous discussion. If you don't look at what's happening on the ground in real lives, people's real lives, what is framed as a whole trend, you can see is really not that simple, right? You have to measure it also in terms of what happened in people's lives. And they saw this. All right, let me look here. I mean, just to show, of course, it brought this notion. This was one of the textbooks for grade 1. And it was a textbook in the United States at the time. So Fun with Dick and Jane. And that's how, Dick said, look up. And then Jane says, run, Dick, run and see. But this was an example, a blonde girl, she's probably blue-eyed. So this role model of whiteness is desirable. Certainly that had an influence on, how people think of beauty, beauty contests, and so on. And today we still have this notion of whiteness. If you go to any drugstore, you will find all of those products that for whiteness, because that's still there. It was it was Spanish thing, and maybe even pre-Spanish. So let me then come to a conclusion here that, later on, let's say during the 20s, what happened in the United States had a very strong influence, of course, in what happened here. There was the suffrage movement, associations of women's groups, YWCA were being formed, equivalent here. the beauty contest, businesses where the Filipino style was its own, because the American business was very patriarchal, all male run, big corporations. But the medium scale everyday businesses were really run by women ever since, and still. Except now they have built on their strengths in the service sector, eating, homes, into hotels, restaurants, and so on. So, and in a way, now the issue is what's happening to the men when women have taken over many of the earning aspects, which were supposedly, a male prerogative, that he's supposed to be the head of the household and the number one earner. Okay, so here we are. The American influence through the school system was really crucial, but there were many other elements too in governance, and so on. So the textbooks were all right. Never mind that. Let me just then now. So where are we? That what we're saying is, in a sense, now women are reclaiming the roles we had in pre-Spanish times when Filipinos, whatever we were then, we're reclaiming that in a much different world. But the basis that women are equal to men has been solidly established in a very different environment, but we can certainly trace that to the roots of our heritage. And I'll end there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mary. And now we move our last presenter, last but not the least, Dr. Jayeel Cornelio, The Rise of Militant in the New Narrative. Jayeel?
Hello, Melissa. Malinaw ba? Just wanted to be sure.
Yeah, Nina.
Yes.
Okay, great. Hello. Hello, everyone. My name is Jayeel. I will be speaking as a sociologist of religion. And let me say at the onset that I am very privileged to be part of this conversation. As Melissa mentioned when we were starting, that this roundtable is part of a bigger project that interrogates the situation of Christianity today and historically, and reflecting, and hopefully these conversations will allow us to deepen our answers to the question, magsosorry ba tayo? The first three presenters, more or less, were already hinting at very, very clear answers. What I want to do as a sociologist of religion is to bring us to the here and now. Namely, I want to understand what is Christianity all about today? What does it have to say about gender, which is the overarching theme of this roundtable? But I also want to place that in a wider context. Very briefly, we can no longer say that the Philippines is a Christian country or a Catholic country for that matter, for reasons that I will be spelling out in a bit. But also at the same time, I will be offering a lot of reflections about the state of Christianity today and how it relates to politics and the public sphere. Very, very important for us because we know that a lot of other contemporary churches are making their presence felt in very, very assertive ways. Hopefully, as well, you will see that there is a bigger context in which we should understand the state of religious diversity today. And then at the same time, I wanted to say that when we began this project a year or so ago, I was thinking about militant Christianity. That was the bigger. That's the title that Melissa just shared with us. Militant Christianity, referring to the fundamentalist presence in politics and different spheres of society. I am going to advance that now because my scholarship has progressed in the past few months, and I am going to be sharing this for the first time with you, and I would love to hear your thoughts on this matter. So, the Philippines is the only Christian nation in Asia, a claim widely rehearsed in Philippine society. It is for one often found in media commentaries about Filipinos and their spectacular religiosity. Wala po akong PowerPoint presentation, so just bear with me. Even state agencies resort to this characterization. For many religious leaders, the assumption is even taken for granted. This is why pastors and priests support legislative moves to teach quote unquote biblical literacy and Christian principles in public schools. Kasi nga, we're assuming that this is a Christian nation. So deep-seated is the idea that it becomes a problem whenever one accounts for corruption, poverty, and other social ills in the Philippines. The question often is asked is, why do we rank as a corrupt country despite being the only Christian nation in Asia? Paulit-ulit yan. The claim is a mistake for two reasons. The first is that the state, based on the Constitution, is secular. The practice of religion in public sphere, such as religious processions, is generally allowed in the spirit of benevolent neutrality. In this manner, the Supreme Court recognizes the contribution of religion to public life. The second reason is demographic. Proportionally speaking, Timor-Leste, the youngest nation state in Southeast Asia, has by far more Catholics than the Philippines, 90%, if I'm not mistaken. Alongside showcase of democracy, nabanggit yan kanina, the label was applied to the Philippines when the country gained its independence from the US in 1946. Although these labels asserted the uniqueness of the country in post-war Asia, they denoted a condescending attitude that had alienated the Philippines from her neighbors. Thus, the country's foreign secretary wanted them abandoned as early as the 1960s. We should no longer call the Philippines a Christian country in Asia. And yet, the idea that the Philippines is the only Christian nation in Asia continues to persists. No? The point of this chapter is to show that in spite of its geopolitical, the point of my presentation is to show that in spite of its geopolitical undertone, the claim has gained traction over time because it became a powerful religious assertion from politics to the religious sphere. The official documents of the Catholic Church were initially instrumental in this regard. But as I will demonstrate to you, the religious landscape in the Philippines has become far more diverse. Many Christian groups now assert their claim to the nation in their own ways. I am framing these assertions in terms of, this is it, theological nationalism. Theological nationalism. What do I mean by that? It refers to discursive claims made by religious groups about the Christian identity of the Philippines. They do so using theologically inspired justifications, which invoke religious resources like the Bible, scriptures, and spiritual encounters. You will see later on mga visions or dreams, very common among evangelicals and charismatics, to argue for the divine destiny of the country as, you guessed it, the only Christian nation in Asia. To this end, I will highlight discourses emanating not just from the Catholic Church, but also other religious groups. For those of you who are aware of writings on this, see Father Mario Francisco has written important works analyzing the official statements of the church on the nation and nationalism. This chapter or my presentation builds on his by also drawing on other emerging groups, the experience of other groups such as megachurches like Victory, Evanation, evangelical churches like Jesus, and indigenous and restorationist churches, Iglesia ni Cristo, Kingdom of Jesus Christ, si Apollo Kiboloy. And then towards the end of my presentation, I will be reflecting on the consequences of theological nationalism on the social and political life in this country. I'm very, very much interested in the material, social, political consequences of these claims, religious claims about the nation na paulit-ulit natin narinig hanggang ngayon. In the rest of the presentation, I will be first highlighting the Catholic Church and spell out what the church hierarchy has said and written about the Philippines being a Catholic nation. And then after that, I will be turning my attention to other religious groups, other Christian groups. So, number one, the Catholic Church. During the National Eucharistic Congress in 1954, no less a figure than President Ramon Magsaysay himself dedicated the Filipino people to the Sacred Heart of Jesus. So dinedicate niya tayo. Sabi niya, we are especially grateful for the light of faith which we uniquely among the nations of the Far East enjoy, and for the air of freedom in which, shielded by our Constitution, we may live and act with the liberty and dignity befitting men who have been created in the image and likeness of God. So no qualms about our identity from the President himself. For Chelly Barry, who has been writing about this for a while now. Given the rise of communism in Asia, it was unmistakable that the consecration was at once religious and political. 1950s. The move was heavily criticized in the media, interestingly, for various reasons, including it being a violation of the principle of church-state separation. Meron na tayo nun, even at that time. Through the writings of its bishops, even in the Malola's constitution, if I'm not mistaken. Through the writings of its bishops, the Catholic Church played a significant role in galvanizing this claim. Relying on bishops' statements from the 1940s, si Father Mario narrates the trajectory of this imaginary. In the 1940s, nationalist sentiments that rejected the role of the church engendered a defensive disposition on the part of the bishops. Defensive. Specifically, in the wake of the Philippine independence, public education, we know this, became a battleground for the Catholic Church over the elimination of religious instruction and the introduction of nationalist publications. Kaya nga, in 1950, the Catholic Welfare Organization, which was the predecessor of today's CBCP, condemned the teaching of Rafael Palma's biography of Jose Rizal. Sabi ng CBCP ito, we believe that we would seriously fail in our duty if we did not raise our voice of warning and protest against the attempt by the enemies of the Catholic name to impose on the young people in our public schools the reading of a book written by a well-known anti-Catholic, Jose Rizal. And and Rafael Palma, which is highly offensive to the religious sentiment of over 80% of the population of the Philippines. Tapos, from the 1960s onwards, a shift took place in which the Catholic Church began seeing its role as to side with the Filipino people, particularly the marginalized. So nagkaroon ng shift, no, from the national identity to something else. This shift coincided with the Second Vatican Council. But for Father Mario Francisco, statements released by the CBCP from then on viewed the Philippines as a Catholic nation, quote unquote, at work in the task of national development. Dati, against anti-Catholicism, by the 1960s, it became about national development. So makita natin yung shift. This was a major turn for the Catholic Church, which beforehand was accused of elitism. In 1970 naman, the CBCP declared the Philippines as a Christian and a democratic country, quote unquote. In the spirit of this conviction, the clergy made commentaries on social and political concerns. In fact, in the pastoral exhortation on Philippine politics, um, the CBCP claims that our faith in God, quote, has played a key role in major events of our history, even in the decidedly political manner, like the People Power Revolution in EDSA. Okay, later on, we see that, especially after the 1980s, from the 1980s onwards, social justice became the major theme of CBCP statements about the Philippines being a Catholic country. So we see the trajectory, anti-Catholicism, and then national development, and then social justice, and a little bit of national development. To this day, the Catholic Church, through its Catechism for Filipino Catholics, continues to frame the Philippines as, quote, the only Christian nation among our Asian brethren. There are deep affinities between Christ's message and the inmost ways of thinking and acting. So may ganun claim. It's our inherent disposition to be Christian, to be Catholic. Unquote. Parang ganun. Yun yung quote. No? In recent years, the CBCP has also approved the annual consecration of the Filipino people to the of Mary. Sabi ng CBCP, behold, as we gather before your elate heart, we desire the church of the Lord in our land, joined in heart and mind with all our people. Isang bayang Filipino, to unite ourselves with the consecration which, for love of us, your Son made of himself to the Father. So that shift gears. Let's move on to what other churches are saying and doing. Um, uh, Here we will see that other churches are now beginning. Here we see that other churches are now beginning to claim the nation, but in a different manner. So I hope to spell this out. So, what are the emerging? What do emerging To kanina, I'm interested in victory, Jesus, evangelical churches like Jesus is Lord, restorationist churches like Iglesia ni Cristo, and the Kingdom of Jesus Christ headed by Apollo Kibuloy. The religious landscape in the Philippines now diverse, even if 80% of Filipinos might still consider it to be Catholic. We can talk about religious diversity and the different definitions of religious diversity later on if you want, but for now, for the time being, for the sake of argument, it is diverse precisely because this reality of diversity is undeniable. We see them on television, we see them in public space, we see them present through their architectures and buildings around the country. Um, Obviously, their convictions differ on such matters as soteriology, ecclesiology, worship, and even the divinity of Christ. We know that Iglesia ni Cristo does not claim the divinity of Christ. Their prominence is evident in several respects, mga buildings, television programs, what I have just mentioned. My analysis of their theological claims to the nation requires some nuance. Their claims are made on the basis of one, the divine calling of the nation, and two, this is where it becomes crucial, critical, the need to uphold and controversial, the need to uphold values God wants for the Philippines in order for it to progress. So national progress is very much tied to certain values. You will see later on very conservative values, which relates to conservative attitudes about gender. Many of the official statements of the CBCP of the Catholic Church about the Philippines are deployed of in defense against ideologies inimical to its religious heritage, which ultimately defines Filipino-ness. In other words, there is a strong link between being Catholic and being Filipino. Kanina yon. This is not the claim of emerging churches. By appealing to the divine calling of the nation and to biblical values, whatever they might be, conservative in fact, they are in effect, these emerging churches in effect are asking for spiritual conversion for the sake of the nation. Implicitly, this appeal is a critique of the failure of the Catholic Church to inspire moral and national renewal. Very compelling there. So what did they do? In 2004, maalala po natin lahat ito, to inspire renewal was indeed the hope of Brother Eddie Villanueva, who ran for president in the Philippines in 2004 and then in 2010. Banking on the what he believed was the born again vote. The founder and head pastor of Jesus is Lord, the biggest evangelical church in the Philippines, Villanueva formed the party believing that the country needed to be governed by righteous leaders. Kaya nagtayo siya ng Bangon Pilipinas and Philippines Arise, and Villanueva's campaign was run by the Intercessors for the Philippines and the Philippines for Jesus movement, two organizations that Villanueva himself founded in the 1980s. Launched as initiatives for God and country, Diyos at Bayan, familiar, they pray for a transformation on the premise that, quote, only the gospel can change the course of history. Victory naman, Victory Church, we're very familiar with it, a church that targets students, espouses exactly the same principle. They're not in politics, but they have the same principle. The church is not politically involved in a strict sense, but their belief is that, quote, as we reach out to students in the campuses, we help them grow in their character and faith, which translates to their ability to not only transform their campuses, but also their communities for the better. The principle is that conversion, while in universities, can make the students values-driven influencers of society. The Victory is now one of the most successful megachurches in the country. Konti na lang po. Now, evident in the theological nationalism of emerging churches is the divine calling of the Philippines. Watch this. Now, this divine calling is most of the time linked to global missions. This much is true in the case of Jayeel and Victory, churches that have outreaches around the world. For them to send missionaries is the divine destiny of the Philippines. This is our destiny, which explains why they have established training centers in the country. So, ang dami-daming mga seminaries and training centers, training Filipinos and even Asians to be deployed to other parts of Asia and the world. For Victory, our role in our larger global movement is to reach every nation in Asia. Quote, Asia is our mission field. So you see the global disposition there. In other cases, theological nationalism is rooted in the prophetic calling of churches and their founders. So kung kanina biblical basis, ito naman makikita natin that it is about visions and dreams. This much is true in Iglesia ni Cristo. The founder of Iglesia ni Cristo, Felix Manalo, they believe was prophesied in the Bible itself. Obviously, INC was established in 1914, but it believes that Felix Manalo, was the Filipino angel of the East, quote, who fulfilled, quote, ancient prophecies set forth in the book of Isaiah, chapter 41, 43, 46, Revelation, and other biblical texts. So from the Old and the New to the New Testament. Today, INC has more than 2 million members around the world. Similarly, the Kingdom of Jesus Christ, or with its founder, Apollo Kibuloy, who proclaims himself to be the appointed Son of God, has a similar disposition or similar experience. Kibuloy had a mystical encounter at the foot of Mount Apo in Davao City, this time in the south, in Mindanao, which convinced him that the place, Mount Apo, was destined to be the new Jerusalem. He has transformed the area, at least that area that he owns, into what he calls the Prayer Mountain and Paradise Garden of Eden restored. So kitang-kita natin yung restorationist theology being manifest in the here and now, which is derived from their own visions and mystical experiences. But it also alludes to the Bible. His life story recounts the encounter with God as follows. Quote, magandang basahin ko po kasi very interesting yung narrative. The standard I use in this mountain for salvation is the standard I will use all over the world. The Father had said, I will send you to them, Apollo. I have many children in the cities of the world. They do not know you, Apollo, and you don't know them. But when they hear your voice, Apollo, they will follow you because my sheep know my voice. Kaya may claim that Apollo Kibuloy is the appointed son of God, which interestingly, if you were watching his programs, intently as I do for research purposes, he is already beginning to claim himself to be God. But we can discuss that later on. In conclusion, so what does what so what is there to theological nationalism, Jayeel? Um, I have two questions really. What exactly is being claimed, and what are the biblical or religious foundations of these claims? Magkaiba eh. Theological nationalism, broadly speaking, claims the Christian identity of the nation of the Philippines, but two different trajectories. For the Catholic Church, it has been about education, politics, and social justice, especially in the contemporary period. But for the emerging churches, it has been about divine calling, global missions, and to a great extent, national renewal and political influence. The justifications also differ. For the Catholic Church, the Catholics' long history with the faith and its consecration to God are powerful ontological claims or statements. For the emerging churches, by contrast, the basis is found in encounters with God, the centrality of spiritual conversion, and even the Great Commission, Matthew. But so how consequential is theological nationalism? Dito na po papasok yung conservative politics, conservative worldviews. I end this presentation by reflecting on this question in view of its social and political consequences. It is a double-edged sword. Theological nationalism is a double-edged sword that can be used either for the common good or as a weapon against proponents of a different moral or religious worldview. Pwedeng common good, pwedeng weaponized. This tension is to be expected given the situation of religious diversity today. For example, social justice and national renewal through converted disciples are two principles that operate with different assumptions and end goals. Clearly, at the core of these differences lie competing visions of what it means to be a Christian nation. Such identity is normative but not homogeneous. This is because the religious claim to the nation is no longer the monopoly of just one institution. As a result, the Catholic Church might hold on to this conviction, but it is not above criticism. Um, Indeed, a case can be made that theological nationalism has engendered compelling visions for the common good. The Catholic Church, I believe, is pretty good at this. No, human rights, progress, and democracy around the country. Of course, controversial then, because we have the reproductive health issue, divorce, and same-sex marriage, and the like. No, but it's not unique to the Catholic Church. We find it also in Iglesia Ni Cristo. They have a lot of humanitarian work. But the contemporary theological claim to the nation poses its own problems as well. And this is where my interest in politics and religion comes in. Inasmuch as it has served the common good, theological nationalism has also been weaponized against policies inimical to Catholic doctrine. In the name of national holiness, Catholic clergy and lay have resisted progressive policies involving artificial contraceptives, divorce, same sex marriage, and gender equality. Interestingly, some religious leaders themselves or members of the religiously inspired parties have become politicians. Alam natin yun. We see now the presence of Baptist pastors and politicians, no less than the speaker himself, who claim that they are born again or Bible believing evangelical Christians, and they use the Bible and deploy its metaphors to say no to certain policies and argue why, for example, Duterte is God's anointed. In this capacity, they have used the Bible to argue that Duterte's bloody war on drugs is necessary to cleanse society and that Filipinos are called to obey the authorities. They have also used theological insights to argue against moves to legalize same sex marriage and gender equality in the country. Last sentence. These recent developments raise important concerns about the contribution of religion to public life in the Philippines. I therefore hope na yung mga napag-usapan natin about gender ngayon and about how the contemporary state of religious diversity and Christianity in the Philippines and how they are challenging progressive values, if you will, or in such areas as gender equality are going to be points of contestation from here on. Maraming salamat po.
Thank you, Jayeel. And thank you to the rest of the panel. Very rich narratives indeed. And I will remind everyone here today that we are in a roundtable discussion. So this is not usual conference format where we open the floor for questions. So I would, at some point, of course, we will open the table up, but we first have to ask everyone to come to the table. And maybe to do that, I want to throw out a question to everyone, who has given their piece, no? It's interesting how we have two papers. We have Ray's paper and Estela's paper presentation that talks about um, specific points in time where a narrative was lost. So we have, for example, Ray talking about the Virgin Mary and Magdalene and how that has changed. And it's still a very important conversation because places like Ateneo, for example, have Virgin Mary as their patron saint. So how does that speak to the current generation? We have Estela who talks about the Babaylan and how abruptly that disappeared from the narrative of faith in the Philippines. And then Mary and Jayeel, wala na yung mga Dr. Jayeel and Mary. I hope
No need. No need.
all right.
That's fine.
Mary and Jayeel talk about I think two very important contexts, which is education and politics, where you have this narrative, constantly changing and new important questions are being asked. So siguro isang round lang, no, before I'm going to open the floor and pala two questions later on. But maybe one round so that the papers can talk and important points can be re-stressed. Number one, what does each participant or panel member think was lost? What is a key thing that was lost in the narratives that you have given? And number two, how do we reestablish what is lost, especially in terms of the spaces and also the people know who can benefit if we are able to create a counter narrative and it reach a particular public. So I'm polisay kasi. So moving forward, where do you think we can move or we can go with this conversation? Maybe we can go in the same direction. We can start with Ray.
Yeah. Shall I start? Can I say? Basically the theme. Oh,
Mary,
sorry.
Mary, go ahead.
All right. The the theme is what happened to women, and I mean by definition men too, but what happened to women in all of this period where church and state together under Spain and made women subservient. The powerful women who were there, who had roles in society, were crushed. The Babaylan, and an image of a subservient, lovely, caring person who must cater to the males in her setting. That's the good person. Redefining the Filipina for all social classes, even though it didn't really apply to maybe the rest of the 80%, because they were working in the fields, they have to live, they have to sell. It was focusing so much on rethinking the well-off woman who was in convent schools and under control of the church, basically. And that has continued to this day. I mean, the fact that this church still doesn't have, not even women deacons are, they're fighting about that. Of course, priests, forget it. They are losing so much of the talent and power and strength and willingness of Filipinas to contribute in many ways. They do anyway, right? But the fact that you lose women's capacity, if you still, feel that there's something to contribute to this church, then, but yet you're left out from any decision making. I mean, that's what's lost. That I think we have to look at that again, right? And I mean, the fact that I teach at a Catholic university, this is why I care about that, because that kind of Catholicism is not what many of us who are believers think it's that the structures really undermine the spirit of genuine Christianity. Jesus Christ was a reformer. He was an activist. He attacked the institutions, very validly. And yet we are all asked as women to accept that this is the way it should be. Well, I think that's a counter narrative that we have to make stronger, and in line with what Carl Gaspar said. Should we say sorry? Yes, the church should say sorry today to women and still say sorry to today's women because of how we are treated in the formal system of the church. Okay? Thank you.
Thank you, Mary, for a very strong opening statement. We will move now to Ray.
Hello.
Hi, Ray.
Okay. What was lost and how do we try to recover, respond? Okay, what was lost? I guess what was lost based on not just my paper but also listening to what the others have said. I think we mainly lost the stories or the narratives that could have come from other voices or the othered voices or dissonant voices. Like Estela even mentioned that for the Babaylans, we don't have a recording of what they themselves have written, and we are trying to reconstruct how they might have done things from the lens of the texts that we have now, and it's a very challenging thing to do. And like what Mary is also saying, women have a lot of experiences, and now we don't just say that there's just one hegemonous woman person. Like we also have women from different social status, cultural backgrounds, even religions. But because we've been often listening just to the prevailing narrative, we lose the opportunity to hear these voices. Also, we are losing the opportunity to hear the non-Christian voices, whether the pre-colonial voices like that of the Babaylans, or the contemporary voices, because yun nga, as Jayeel has mentioned, we tend to imagine the Philippines as a Christian country or a Catholic nation. And in that sense, I think we are also losing a part of ourselves by not hearing those stories. Like, they're not just people we other, pero there are kapwa. We also learn more about who we are or who we can be by being in conversation with others. But if we're drowning those voices, we tend to also lose a part of ourselves, and we end up sticking or repeating the same grand narrative based on one faith or on the prevailing patriarchal discourse. I think what is needed now is an opportunity to tell stories and retell stories, and uh, not just from the perspective of people who have been often telling stories. I guess we also have to parang be open to different ways of telling these stories. Diba? Hindi, it's not always in an academic way. Um, but we do so not with the aim of recovering or constructing just one story again. I hope na we do it with an awareness na that there are really many stories, and we don't have to always synthesize or integrate everything under one narrative. It's just really uh, we are different people with diverse experiences and perspectives, and differences enrich us. So for the church, kasi for theology, I think we have to enhance the attitude of listening, diba, of voice to voices within the church, and also voices that the church can be in dialogue with. Kasi sometimes we've been too preoccupied with preaching, so we also have to learn to listen more. Yun po.
Thank you also, Ray. That was a very good intervention as well. I just wanted to repeat what she said, parang enlarging or enriching the attitude of listening. Yeah, um, more robust sense of awareness. Can I, para akong teacher, can I call Estela to also say
Yeah. Oh, yes. Can you hear me?
Yes.
yes,
Can you hear me? All right. So, from my end, actually, I'm very thankful to have this chance of listening talaga from different points of view or vantage point of view. Why? Because I'd like to look at the bigger picture. In terms of what? In terms of what is the umbrella, no? In terms of our research, in terms of our looking into the role of the church. Looking back in terms of my sharing of about the Babaylan, the importance of counter narrative. Uh, as based on your question, Melissa, I think the importance of looking of what was lost. That I think we lost one of the important pillars of building a nation, because I see the big umbrella as building the nation. In the end, we're still doing that, and there have been so many changes along the way, and many things are lost. We've been trying to look for those lost aspects of our history. So I see it as a very important act to write once again, to rewrite, to reconstruct, to review history by inserting this history of women from the past up to the present. Why women? Well, I'd like to see women as should be considered as a very active aspect of society, the pillar of the society. So, in that sense, as mentioned by Ray, stories will have to be told. Stories should be, in a way, proliferated. Stories should be written. Stories should be shared, not only in terms of writing history, but as mentioned a while ago, but to be presented in different platforms in that sense. So, why? Because I'd like our students, other people, the next generation to know that women were empowered in the past. It's just that the challenges that were brought by the increasing foreign powers would be so instrumental in the change of mindset regarding women. So the counter narratives would have to be so important in reclaiming the past, in reclaiming what should be important in our nation building as we remodel, as we hone once again our own image as a nation. If nation still is very important for all of us. But the second question, what was who should benefit from who will benefit from this kind of heavy counter narratives? So it's not only about the issue about the church. It's not only that. More than that is more on our students, our people. So the benefit of hearing about history, sometimes people say, oh, history is so boring. And I think we should develop other platform in presenting history. But for me, who will benefit? This would be those people, especially the young ones, who are still looking for identity, who are still looking for belongingness, who are still looking for the meaning. This is our history. The part of the present time is very crucial in meaning making, in terms of history and in terms of nation building. So I guess by presenting counter narratives that will enhance these views from history and the contemporary times would actually help in that dreaming about the nation that we aspire for.
Thank you. Also, as a political scientist, I really appreciate that our story isn't finished, that we are still building our nation, and that these counter narratives are indeed an important pillar in moving forward. And of course, the role of the youth, that they should be very much involved in the meaning making as we move forward. And Jayeel. Jayeel has now a very large role to play because he will speak last. So, Jayeel?
May I just say that it's so nice to be the minority here, to be the only male academic, and to be listening to powerful insights from our very well and highly esteemed colleagues, no, in the social sciences and humanities. But anyway, um, Melissa, my answer to your question is this: because I am a sociologist working on contemporary issues, my reflection is not so much about what we have lost as it is about what is being silenced. By claiming the Philippines to be the only Christian nation in Asia, many things are in fact deliberately silenced because the Christian identity is in itself very, very normative. And we've seen that from the point of view of the Catholic Church, especially in the early 20th century, but more so now among evangelical churches and other emerging churches. It is as if there is only one way of being Christian. And if you are Christian, therefore you should be anti-divorce. If you are Christian and you're a Filipino, therefore you should be anti-same-sex marriage. If you are a Christian and you're Filipino, then you should not be supportive of gender equality or sojibil and whatnot, and so on and so forth. So in that sense, what I am, and this has been not only my scholarly passion, but also my personal advocacy, really it is to widen the the religious discourse, the ability to talk religion, debate religion, and challenge its assumptions in the context of a secular society like the Philippines. And I feel that invoking the situation of the youth right now, and because my scholarship has also dealt with young people, I know that we are at a crossroads. If we look at the statistics, attitudes towards these issues are changing very fast. Religiosity is also changing very fast in different ways. And failure to confront this conservatism will in fact spell a huge trouble, a lot of trouble for religious institutions in time to come. Why? Because we know in the history of other places that that antagonism or hostility towards gender equality, for example, has engendered a lot of frustration and disappointment with institutional religion. So there's a lot of insights that we can pick up upon realizing what is being silenced by this claim that the Philippines is the only Christian nation in Asia. Salamat, Melissa.
May,
Jayeel,
may
that's
I?
oh, sorry. That's also the beginning of another conversation. Moving forward. I heard Dr. Nalsita. Go ahead po.
Okay. May I just make three comments as an anthropologist? Now, regarding gender stratification, I think we should be careful about saying that gender stratification has not been universal. Even feminist anthropologists would say that, in fact, gender stratification has been universal, but it varies in intensity according to the mode of subsistence. Let me just explain. Sherry Ortner, for example, points out that because it is men who hold power in a society, it's they who dictate the values of that society. So women tend to be seen either as the paragon of virtue or the paragon of vice, as embodied goodness or embodied evil. So to give an example, in Southeast Asia, okay, so Southeast Asia has bilateral kinship. So one would imagine that women are fully equal, but not quite, because, okay, it is true that the mother is seen as the embodiment of morality. There's that famous Malay Indonesian saying, Surya di kaki ibu. Now, paradise is to lie at mother's feet. However, it's interesting that throughout Southeast Asia, whether you talk about Thailand, Cambodia, Malaysia, Indonesia, and the Philippines, the embodiment of evil is actually the head of a woman that goes around at night with the entrails hanging like a sausage factory. Krasuwe in Thailand, in Malaysia, Indonesia, in the western part, Peninggalan in the Philippines, Manananggal. In eastern Indonesia, she is called Swangi in the Philippines, Aswang. So there is that ambivalence, and she says that actually that kind of ambivalence is true actually of all cultures. No? It's because it's the men who hold the reins of power. Now, the other thing too is if you're going to be economic determinists, a la Marx or a la cultural ecologists, you better go all the way. Let me just point out why. Because hunting and gathering, okay, generally it's a misnomer. It's the women who actually forage. They provide most of the food to the budget of the home. So here, women have power, but still not as much as the men. It's still the men who preside at the village councils, but women participate, which is very different from agriculturists. Now, yesterday I spoke about the Ilongot. Actually, they're Sweden cultivators. Yes, women have influence, but the men still look down on them because liget, the energy that is so esteemed, is associated with the men. Now, in Sweden, cultivation, it's true the men cut down the forest, they burn the forest, but women contribute heavily also to the budget because they're able to plant easily. Now, the big gap occurs actually with sedentary agriculture, because it's the men who have to construct the dikes and the canals. So because they're given a lot of labor, their presence is much more esteemed, and you can see clearly the change, because whereas in most of the Philippines, which was shifting cultivation until the coming of Christianity, the priests, the ones who preside at rituals in Ifugao are men, the baki, okay, not female shamans. It's the baki, the men. So there is a correlation. Also, in the case of pastoralists, which Jews have been, the Hebrews have been pastoralists, and Arabs too, and of course the Indo-Europeans, pastoralists. It's the men who play a very important role because they have to defend the cattle and the sheep against wild animals. So very, very masculinist. Well, Well, there's some debate about what happens during the advent of industrialism, but I don't want to go into that. But I'm just saying we have to be careful about generalizing that equality was dominant in the Philippines already beforehand. I think it has to be nuanced. Um, the third thing I wanted to point out is I think when we look at rituals in pre-Hispanic Philippines, I think we have to look at it holistically. Yes, we should value the shaman because the shaman embodies the knowledge of the community. The shaman communicates with the spirits. At the same time, she embodies the lore, the learning of the community. But we have to remember that a lot of the rituals of our ancestors were bloody. As I mentioned yesterday, the Ilongota, because, from afar, their existence seems idyllic because they're Swedeners, there's equality. But headhunting is practiced against whoever is not a member of the kin group. And when we talk about Ifuga, for example, who are agriculturists, the feuding between Ifugaos was really a feuding between valleys. The more distant the valley, the more likely the people would be seen as enemies. So I hope we keep that in mind. I hope we keep that dimension in place because yes, I understand why we should be condemning the fraile for just throwing everything overboard now for persecuting the Shan. But he was confronted with this problem that human sacrifice was so widespread in the islands. There was bloodshed. Every time somebody died, members of the community would go hunting for somebody to sacrifice, even if the member of the community, even though the fellow who died of natural causes or illness. There was always that bloodshed. So there was feuding, a lot of feuding. Now, I also raise this point because I'm concerned actually with patterns of aggression today in the Philippines. It's not necessarily because of structural violence. Direct violence in the Philippines not always because of the rich versus poor, because I find this at all levels. This fascination with a gun, for me, is frightening. Why do many Filipinos feel they have to own a gun and even display it? I in my class on leadership for graduate students, we always talk about different types of leadership in the country. We review from the Negritos to the Tiruray, who are very peaceful, the Ilongot, Ifugao, all the way down to the Christian peoples, all the way to the Muslim. And when we were discussing the case of the Ilongot, some of my male students said they can connect with it because the emphasis on symbolic violence for them, because when they were growing up, their fathers taught them to own a gun and to possess a gun as part of their masculinity. So that has also to be faced. That aspect, we should not look at only one side of the rituals of our ancestors. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jalceta, for that comment. I think your point is well taken, no, on nuancing also the discussions that we've heard here today. I'm going to go through the chat box now, and I'll pose questions to particular speakers. And the first one is for Ray. How will you extend your analysis of the images of both Marys to the status of Mary Magdalene as an already venerated patroness of some Spanish era Catholic parishes in the Philippines? Ray, we're coming up to the end of the session, so maybe we can give a short intervention. I know it's a complicated question, but maybe a short intervention of about 1 to 2 minutes.
Oh, sorry, Melissa, can you repeat the question?
Okay. How will you extend your analysis of the image of both Marys to the status of Mary Magdalene as an already venerated patroness of some Spanish era Catholic parishes in the Philippines?
Okay. Sige, so if I understand the question right, it's the person is asking, uh, how do we understand Mary Magdalene as already being very venerated. We have churches named after her already, whereas um, we we have also seen in tradition how she has been portrayed as a whore or a woman of lesser value. Um, well, actually, in scripture, it's never mentioned that she's a prostituted woman. In scripture, we find her as someone who has been uh, possessed by seven demons, and then Jesus exorcised her. She's a follower of Christ. She stood at the foot of the cross. She's the first witness to the resurrection, and she has been commissioned by Christ to spread the good news about his resurrection. So um, it's true, and as we have also seen that she was introduced to the Philippines already as a saint. But in in popular understanding, in the popular way that she is remembered, the way we picture her has often been colored by Pope Gregory the First's conflation of the different women uh, who have been sexually suspect in the Bible. Okay, and so we now have it's not really just a homogeneous um, remembrance of Mary. So that if we just look at scripture, we see her um, as an as a follower of Christ. But yun nga, as we have found, somehow what still sticks to people's minds, even if um, she is recognized as a saint, is that combined image of her. Ayun. Did I answer the question ba? Hello?
Thank you, Ray. I have another question, this time for Estela. So I can see Estela still with us now on board. The
Yep.
question
Yes.
is actually dalawa yan. I wonder, how do you see the use of Durkheim's sacred profane binary as an analytical tool to understand the Spanish Filipino encounter? And does profane always signify evil? I
All right.
can,
Thank you. Yeah.
okay.
Thank you for the question, Melissa. I think the most important thing to think about is I used it because, again, I'd like to explore the lenses, no, the one being used by the Spaniards as they actually, in a way, looked into uh, the actuations of the Babaylan, and on the other hand, also the lenses being used by the Babaylan looking into the Spanish incursion. So for me, by using those two lenses in a way would help me present what really happened. Not necessarily exactly what happened, but in terms of the perspectives of two parties in narrating what really happened during that time, or in narrating their own stories to come up with historical, to put it in historical space. So for me, there are so many ways of doing it. I can actually use different theories to explain it. But for me, I'll start small. In terms of just looking of uh, what the reason they did those these killings, tortures, and persecutions of the Babaylan, as in a way having that reason of the conquista, or at the same time, conversion and evangelization. On the other hand, that's the point of view of the Spanish missionaries, using it as progressing towards uplifting the sacredness of things and cutting off those things that are of the devil or something profane. But turning the tables around, you can see through the eyes of the Babayan also almost the same thing as the stories would have it, that they look at the things that they were doing as part and parcel of the sacred, how they will be used as instruments of the sacred according to indigenous cosmology, And what the Spaniards did to them would be considered as profane or irreverent or not of God. So, in a way, I'd like to use those two lenses first, now, before I go on in deeply into the discussion of or trying to come up with a theory to address both. So, for me, the most important thing is to enter the picture first, no, enter the field of the stories first, and not use my own, not use any theories or not use my own interpretation. Just go on and read the stories about those two parties, and along the way, perhaps I'll find a way to reconstruct the stories, and only then additional analysis to actually prove my point or disprove my point in terms of what was the sacred or the profane in terms of what happened in history vis-a-vis the encounter of the Babaylan and the Spanish missionaries.
Thank you. And I'm moving quickly now because I'm watching the time. We have a question for Jayeel. Um, how does the inconvenient truth of Catholicism in Timor-Leste undermine the Philippine Catholic Church's theological nationalism? Jayeel?
I, I think that's a very insightful question. See, Julius Bautista is doing a lot of work right now sa Timor-Leste, and I find that very impressive and how he's comparing the situation, the Catholicism in the Philippines and in sa Timor-Leste. But the quick answer to that is that um, I don't think people know sa Philippines, or at least the religious leaders care that Timor-Leste complicates the picture here, because it goes against the narrative that the Philippines is the only Christian nation in Asia. Bring in Timor Leste, and then that all of a sudden um, uh, problematizes this whole grand eschatological narrative that the Philippines is destined for the evangelization of the world, of Asia, and then the rest of the world. I don't know if it's really just ignorance or deliberate dismissal of this reality. But in my next fieldwork, I will be definitely mentioning, bringing that up in the interviews. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Jayeel. We have 1 minute, and I don't think I will burden Mary with the specific question. Mary, maybe you'd like to give some maybe preliminary insight moving forward, or just one thought before we close, no, on what we've heard and seen thus far.
Dr. Lau. Um, Actually, it's
Yes.
okay. We can go ahead and address this question as well. I was informed that we can accommodate a couple more questions, actually.
Okay. So, all right. Okay, so I will extend a little bit, but maybe because I opened that space for Mary. Mary, maybe you can make a general comment on directions that we're headed, given the variety of questions that have been asked, and specifically from Dr. Jalsita's point of view, where there's a need also for nuancing in our work moving forward.
Yeah. All right. Let me just say, as to segue into what we hope for this program to come, that I hope Jayeel gets into the gender dimensions of some of the points he's saying. Because that's another interesting development with the other, non-Catholic Christianity, and how do they look at women? Whether all right. The other well, on the other thing, let me just say that, to me, what has been shown here, again, and everybody has said that, there are many narratives. There are many counter narratives. We're kind of looking at the counter narratives, but as Dr. Scialza said, it doesn't always have to be that we're kind of on the right side to show that what was lost was really a good thing. He's pointing out, well, no, you have to nuances. There were violent killings, and what about that? That was also part of a cultural response. And so, yeah, so I think we have to be more nuanced, and that's done by looking at the realities in more detail, studying them in greater detail, whether it's historically in the past or what the significance is in the last century or today. And that's why when we started this discussion, which was all very informal, because our dear Carl Gaspar raised that, magsosorry ba tayo? And again, what does that mean? Who should be sorry to what? For what? Uh, and it proceeded from there. I mean, I hope if the people who are listening to this, who are outside this particular group, are inspired and are interested in or already doing some research in problematizing what Christianity brought or didn't bring or destroyed or elaborated on to the Philippines in 500 years would be very important. So we hope that we don't have a big research program with funds. This is not one of those things. It's really a kind of, you might say, grassroots effort, if you consider universities grassroots, in which each of us has a particular interest that we find gets really um, examined or revitalized because other people say something that's actually quite similar, but not really. It's a different field. So kind of you learn from one another. And we're just, today we're what, 9 people. Many have been involved in this discussion, but not, of course, not everybody could be at this presentation today. And I hope we can get more people interested in this. It can be very kind of informal. I don't know if I dare say to Melissa was the one when she was the director of the IPC who said, IPC can be a convening group for this. We're not going to have a program as such, but just build on the fact that people are interested in getting together so we can encourage meetings. I suppose like people want to have more webinars on certain aspects of something of particular interest. Maybe this is something that IPC could consider. And now that we realize that we can connect with one another all over the country as well as even globally, and maybe we can take advantage of that to bring in more narrative, counter-narrative understandings to what happened to us in 500 years of Christianity. Right? So I would encourage people, if they want to pursue this, I'm not, the director of IPC, I don't know if he's listening now, but that they inform IPC, Institute of Philippine Culture, I don't even remember the address, but and say, I'm interested, or this is what I want to do, or just that we develop a network already, just discussion, and then if you're in a university, get funding from your university, or if you need actual funding for this, but as a very flexible network of people interested in very specific concerns that relate to a larger issue, which is the impact of Christianity in the Philippines in 500 years. So that's what I would say.
Thank you, Mary.
Uh,
Mary's very shy because she's actually one of the founders of IPC. So I think you have every right to invite other people who are interested also in this topic. I think Jillian has something to say. Sorry.
yes, okay, sorry. So I mentioned earlier that we had a little bit of time for more questions. I'm sorry about that. I made a mistake, but yeah. So actually, I'd like to say that thank you for all of the insights. This has been a really interesting discussion. And so, yeah, I think we have to wrap up in time for the closing remarks, actually.
Okay, maybe can I have just 1 minute to wrap it up?
Oh,
Is
yes,
that okay?
please. Yes, please.
Okay, just to continue what Mary was saying, IPC will now take on a convenership role. So this exercise, for example, is a very earnest effort, a very long view effort, and we like to hear many different voices from different parts of the country, in our region, different communities. We really welcome the plurality of voices, and this particular topic, gender and counter narratives in 500 years of Christianity in the Philippines, is something which has really organically grown in the past year through discussions in IPC, and we hope to continue also this conversation with many more of you. So I'm not the director anymore of IPC, but on behalf of Dr. Nino Luis and of course Dr. Mary Racelis, and the other participants in this roundtable, Dr. Cornelio, Dr. Sanchez, Dr. Banasihan. Thank you very much to Philippine Studies also for giving us the opportunity to have this roundtable discussion.